My name is Matthew Bashore. I run the Bible Protector Ministry. It's a ministry about upholding the Word of God and being empowered by the Spirit of God. Today the subject, the title of the talk that we're having is Historical Revisionism. Well, that's a very interesting topic. So, when we look at church history, and you can see across the top there, talking about the major portions of New Testament church history, there are three major enemies that believers are in conflict with in church history. And the current enemy is infidelity, which describes the errors coming from the Enlightenment and encompassing an array of ideologies from the spirit of Antichrist, including atheism, agnosticism, deism, rationalism, humanism, political correctness, communism, etc., etc. So if you take a timeline across the top, there was, from the time of Christ, there was a pagan era until Christianity overcame paganism. Then there's been a papal era, and then, especially around the French Revolution, was the start of the infidel era, and here we are today. So, for example, arch-infidel Thomas Paine, 1794, he said, "My own mind is my own church." Infidelity does not consist in believing or in disbelieving. It consists in professing to believe what he does not believe. So it is actually a religion, so-called religion of doubt, an anti-religion religion, one to attack religion with. So we're talking here really about philosophies, like rationalism. Rationalism is using the mind, empiricism, what is seen, etc., etc. And then there's relativism and subjectivism, etc., etc. And there's postmodernism, etc., and even libertarianism. It's like heads on a hydra, on a multi-headed monster. Colossians chapter 2 verse 8 says, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ." And 1 John chapter 5 verse 19 and 20 says, "And we know that we are of God, and the whole world lieth in wickedness. And we know that the Son of God is come, and hath given us an understanding, that we may know him that is true. And we are in him that is true, even in his Son, Jesus Christ. This is the true God and eternal life." So we are in a God who is true, and we should know. So knowledge, godly knowledge. So if you were to look at the tree of error, the tree of infidelity, you would see all kinds of fruits and products coming out of that tree. It's like there's many heads on the monster. But instead of dealing with the root, many people try and deal with the fruit. Like, I'm going to fight communism. Well, actually, you should be fighting what's behind communism. Because the same thing behind communism is really what's behind everything else bad. People get caught up with, this is the enemy over here, that's the enemy over there. What's the actual root? It's spiritual. So I present some theses, some sort of, bedrock sort of presupposition ideas. So one is that the Word is true and the Spirit is true. Then truth trumps facts. Now what does that mean? It means when Jesus says something, that is true, that's more powerful than the circumstance. For example, in Genesis, the fact was that it was dark, but God said, "Let there be light." The fact was that a man was sick, but Jesus said, a word or did something. Truth trumps facts. So health trumps sickness. The health that you didn't see. Jesus cast the devil out. He said, "Go," and the devil went all crazy, thrashing in that person, the possessed person. Well, what's true? The fact might be, it looks like the devil's there. The truth is the devil's going out. But that devil actually is out because he said, to go out. This is exactly the power of what Word of Faith doctrine understands, the power of God's Word being actually authority. So believers of the Word and Spirit, Christian believers, Christians especially advanced Christian believers, are able to possess judgment. In other words, we're able to use and understand and know, this is right, that's wrong, what exactly is right, what exactly is wrong, to know what is, good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. Here are some more theses, some more ideas. And we're talking about historical revisionism now. That was all the foundation. There is objective reality, what really happened. So we're not living in a relative or subjective viewpoint. There is proper history, which is the knowledge of what happened existing in the present. That is, right now, people telling a story about the past, but that story they're telling is factually what actually happened in the past. So there's a difference between that and, of course, people today telling stories about the past that change, make up things, use evidence selectively, or even start from a wrong hypothesis to make up or concoct or whatever motives, whether, out of ignorance or out of lack of knowledge, out of, willingness to corrupt, whatever. So one example we can look at, talking about historical revisionism, is Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell is a man who lives in the 17th century, and there's many different views of Oliver Cromwell. So if he went in his own lifetime, there's obviously different perspectives about who he is and what he stands for. If you ask a royalist or a Presbyterian or a Republican or a Congregationalist or Baptist, that is an independent church person, they all have different views. So yes, well, the solution here would be get a view that's consistent and right with the Bible and with the Spirit of God. Different people are claiming, oh yes, but we're right. The Anglican says they're right, the Presbyterian says they're right, the Baptist says they're right. Who actually is right? This is a thing that needs to be addressed. And don't let the Roman Catholic say, look at your differences, we're just one. No, there's not one Roman Catholic. Roman Catholicism is very divided between what we'll call modernists, conservatives, and ultra-traditionalists. There's not one Catholic, there's conflicts of views there as well. The solution is, of course, to have one. Now, if you went to the 19th century, there's, again, if you asked people from the, from Parliament in London, in Westminster, and said, what's the view of Oliver Cromwell? It's very different. I mean, they made a statue of Oliver Cromwell. Very different to, say, an Irish Catholic view of Oliver Cromwell, and they hate him with a passion. If you went to the 21st century, i.e. now, and you took the infidel perspective, for example, there's people with Marxist Marxist interpretation. That already was happening in the 20th century, but Marxist interpretation, look at the levelers and, overthrowing the rich and overthrowing the upper class, all this kind of stuff. Well, infidels have their agenda. So we're talking really about people's agendas. If you to ask monarchists today, for example, at the monarchist type group meetings, I mean, they'll be quoting poetry against the House of Cromwell there. So they don't like Cromwell, apparently. And yet there's other monarchists, like Orangists, who do like Cromwell. So that's very, very interesting as just a case study to show, yes, there's different perspectives, but it actually ties back into what's the foundation to their worldview. Okay. Now let's talk about Guy Fawkes. People have made some pretty anti-Christian type of productions. I'll talk about two. One is a BBC, I believe it's BBC production called Gunpowder, Treason and Plot. Makes out King James to be a maniac or something, Guy Fawkes is a victim of a conspiracy, etc., etc. Very, very much revisionary, very much trying to change the past. Now, why is this even an important thing that we're bringing up? Because if you have a biblical view, you're going to have a biblical view about nations, about life, about events. Are you going to recognise that God, by His divine providence, saved King James and the King James Bible translators from being blown up in a terrorist act, with Guy Fawkes, or take some other conspiratorial anti-Christian view like, oh well, that gunpowder would have been wet and wouldn't have exploded anyway, or oh, actually the authorities knew about it and they exploited it for other, personal means or whatever. And then you can watch different productions, because one will blame Cecil, the Lord Cecil, and another will blame King James or whoever else. It's very easy for the modernist to, it's the tendency of the modernist, of the modern day people, not to want to stick with a pro-Christian perspective. One of the most evil movies ever made that I know of is called V for Vendetta. It was written as a comic book series. Alan Moore wrote. He's obviously, if you even know anything about him, he's a Satanist type fellow. Here he is writing an anti-conservative, obviously anti-Christian thing, which was then taken by people with an agenda against Christianity clearly. Even if it doesn't, in their movie portrayal doesn't specifically just go out just to attack Christianity, the implication is it's entirely anti-Christian because it's pro-anarchist, it's pro everything wrong, including pro-terrorism, and this idea of, yes, the people can fight against authority and things like that. Well, why would you have something, promoting that? Not even anything about the real story about Guy Fawkes, but a complete modernist fabrication, which is entirely wrong anyway. And apparently Christian government apparently will be maniacs running the country, and that's what it would be like. Big Brother and whatever. Some other examples of historical revisionism, and because I'm in Australia, I use some Australian examples as well. For example, there's three areas that I can mention. One is the authority of scholarship. For example, as a historian, Manning Clark, he's done a lot, made these volumes of history, but history is actually not just recording facts. It's all designed as an attack on Australia's heritage, ultimately. In other words, his bias, his viewpoint, is not pro, Christian, pro British Empire used by God or anything like that. It's clearly designed in a different direction. So one of the things you see with historical revisionism is the use of authority, i.e., I've done all this academic work, I'm a professor or whatever, I'm a knowledgeable person, I've been published, etc. It's a very powerful means for being able to convey the information, but actually it's propaganda. Another fact is the power of storytelling. I mean, people like stories, and the use of documentary in particular is a mechanism for telling things, and it's amazing how many times people watch documentaries and then think they're experts on a topic because they saw a documentary about it. Well, documentaries can be, and usually are, not only quite biased, but in many ways quite out there and fake or whatever. I mean, you don't have to watch a few different documentaries to see people have their own barrows to push and axes to grind, etc., etc. So I give one example. Adam Nicholson, he's both done it through visual documentary, but also written a book. He attacks the King James Bible translators. Now, when I say attack, I mean he portrays them not only in as worst as possible light that he can, but also in doing that tries to sensationalise it all as well. Another different example, not Adam Nicholson, is the use of nature documentaries to present a certain worldview, etc. And again, things can be quite nice and interesting. I mean, story about an animal, lion hunting, something like that, hunting its prey. It's all very interesting, and you look at Africa, it's all very wonderful looking when they show it in nature documentaries. But the reality is that if that's being used to convey a story, like say the story of evolution, then that's really wrong. But the third area is the power of visual recreation. That is, when you see something from history being portrayed on the screen, as in the way we absorb information especially by watching it visually. And when you see that, then you begin to think, and this can be a great error of people having seen actors act parts and seen events of history portrayed in films, and seen people's motives as portrayed in films or whatever, or TV, miniseries and so on, and then think it's a very powerful tool. And because you see that, you then sort of have that view of the past. Now, of course, all such things are in that way, with inaccuracy, I guess, as far as it's only a recreation. But the point here is that there's often, if not always, from Hollywood, the BBC, etc., the agenda in their productions to actually deliberately push a wrong point of view, or present things in a bad light that are good, etc. So I just say that this is all pretty obvious stuff, fake news, So now we come to the point here about truth versus infidelity, and we come to different views of things and how they're tainted in common culture. I'm going to go through some different kind of examples, so it might be a little bit educational as well. The first example is Puritans. Today's world thinks Puritans are bad. If you have a proper Christian view, you'd actually see Puritans as good. You'd see things like colonialism, imperialism actually as positive things. Today, infidelity says how bad it is, apparently. Another example, and here we see depicted a picture of the Battle of Castle Hill, and with Major George Johnson and others, and they will say, the British Empire, the English, they took convict prisoners, they took people who committed crimes in Ireland, they, for petty reasons, sent people on ships to New South Wales, to Australia, and they worked sort of as indentured workmanship, and somehow that's really bad. The Irish have had such a bad lot in life, and whatever, and how sympathetic we have to be for the convicts, because apparently they laid the foundation for Australia. All of that's a lie. The foundation of Australia is actually through free settlement, not through convicts, and Australia was started as on the basis of evangelical beliefs, not on this idea of Irish rebels and whatever. And so again, the modern day left-wing approach is to highlight what suits their agenda, i.e. the Irish rebels, who really, whilst they were Catholics, were actually more embracing the doctrines of the French Revolution. This is at the height of the French Revolutionary, or actually Napoleonic Wars, when these sort of things are happening. The next picture there is a picture of the Eureka flag, which is a flag flown at a rebellion that happened in Ballarat in Victoria in Australia, and that was people apparently protesting about paying a license to go and dig gold out of the ground. Like, yeah, you can just go around and do that on Crown land or wherever. So they were protesting about that, but that's taken by left-wing and modernist people. What heroes of democracy these people were, fighting against, fighting against the Christian government of the day. Essentially, that's what they're praising. They're praising rebelling against law and order. Let's fight the government. Like, why? That's not a biblical concept. Why should Christians think that's a good thing? So that's clearly not a good thing. God did not raise up the British Empire to be fought against, but rather to have it be used for promulgating and promoting the Bible as it did when it was doing that. So clearly we see again the modernist view, and of course modern day people take that flag as a symbol, sort of like a left-wing sort of a rebellion type symbol, sort of like the flag of the South in America. The next picture is of a outlaw called in Australia a bushranger, and his name was Ned Kelly. And Ned Kelly went around and wanted to declare a republic, and he wanted to, fight the police and kill people and whatever, which is what he did, by the way, stealing horses as well. So he did all these bad things. Now, today, he will be portrayed, better than Robin Hood. But the reality is this guy was a murderer. Now, this is the problem we have. Here's a darling of the left, someone who stood up against, good government, things like that. And because he's a bad person, he's promoted as good. The last example here you can see is the example of Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, with his hypothesis of evolution, I call it a hypothesis, not a theory here, again, that's something that is a whole view about the past in itself. A whole concocted history of what happened, what really did happen. And that's the conflict, actually. As a Christian, should we be taking at all things and say, well, man is saying this about history, or, saying that the earth is this old and this and that. If we use the Bible, we're going to come to a very different view. And so we see then there is a conflict of ideologies, of ideas, and we see that historical revisionism is actually a tool being used. It's a tool of error to lie about the past, to make up stories or to present things on the basis of bad motives. And we can all understand that. Anyway, I run the website BibleProtector.com. It's about accurately presenting the historical fact of the Bible, the King James Bible, and using it today. God bless.